Hi everyone. Not going to be playing League of Legends today for fairly obvious reasons, but really do appreciate some of you joining me. Anyway, hi Smorty, hi Henry. My name, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dmitry Gozbinsky. I go by DmitryOpines. As you can tell from my accent, I very much grew up in Australia. I live in Switzerland, but I was born in Ukraine. I was born in Kharkiv. It was the Soviet Union at the time, but it was still Ukraine. And I left that country. My parents left with me when I was 6 years old, and I honestly didn't have that much to do with it. I grew up speaking, as a lot of people in Eastern Ukraine do, speaking Russian at home. And I didn't have much to do with the country until I came back to it. God, 20 years later. And the reason I came back to Ukraine was for work. I was an Australian diplomat. I just arrived in Geneva in June 2014 to be a trade negotiator at the WTO for Australia. I was actually on my first European holiday, done a road trip down with a friend of mine. We'd done a road trip all the way down to a place called Cinque Terre in Italy. And I was lying on the beach and I got a phone call from the department saying, hey, I don't know if you saw, but a plane load of Australians were just shot down over Ukraine. How quickly can you be in Kiev? And I basically spent the next, 4 months in Ukraine working as part of that task force, doing a whole bunch of things to establish a diplomatic presence and to work with task forces to try to get investigators to that crash site, recover the bodies of the people in that plane, and bring the bodies home, bring the possessions home. And during that time, I kind of got to know Ukrainians a bit, just because you're in the middle of Kiev for months at a time. You're working 19-hour days, but you're also talking to people. You're meeting them, and you're just seeing the atmosphere of the place. And I gotta tell you guys, if you've never been to post-Maidan Ukraine, you're missing out on genuinely the most inspiringly patriotic place. Patriotic in the best possible sense of the term. Not chauvinism, not patriotism for the sake of saying I am better than you. And there is something missing in my life. I need a way to establish that I am somehow superior to you despite things in my life not going well. I will cling to the fact that I was born here and you were born someplace else, and that will be my defining feature. That wasn't Ukrainian patriotism at all. That's not what it felt like. It was a whole bunch of people who genuinely believed that their country could be better and that their country could be great, and that in fact it was great and it was a project worth investing and believing in. And that's, you don't necessarily always get that in the West talking to almost anybody. It's passé, it's not chic to be that kind of patriotic. In the West, where I guess things have just been better for longer, where things are okay for kind of most people most of the time, and patriotism has been co-opted and it's either sort of jingoistic, militaristic, or it's divisive, or it's a tool of people who you frankly don't want to be seen standing next to. But they were they genuinely just believed, and they were. I mean, again, I say this as somebody who grew up in Australia, and apart from the snakes and really every insect and piece of wildlife in that country, it's hard to imagine a safer upbringing than Australia if you are sort of white in a big city. It's an incredibly safe country. It's an incredibly tranquil country. It calls itself the lucky country, because things just kind of work and nothing bad happens. And so to go from that and to meet people who are on the streets of Maidan, meet Ukrainians who are on the streets of Maidan, who just at some point turned around and said enough was enough, and who risked everything to fight for an idea of what their country could be, was, I mean, it's mind blowing, and it was so unbelievably moving at a time when I thought that I was beyond being moved by that kind of thing, by civic engagement. I thought I had, I was working in government. I knew what government was. I was treating that kind of thing as just a thing that you do. Being in government is important and good, but it is a job like any other. You do your best. You don't get to, at the end of the day, you go home and you think about something else. You have a stiff drink. And this is people, I remember I arrived in the country, and I realize I'm not talking right now. If you guys tuned in for like live updates about the crisis, I haven't got any for you. I'll talk about it in a sec, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But very honestly, it's just, I have nothing useful to say. I have nothing constructive to say. It's horrific beyond words. There are just tanks rolling into the country with my birth, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop them. And we don't know when they'll stop. So instead, you guys get to witness my live therapy and my just live outpouring of how this feels, I guess. And listen, if you guys find that incredibly boring, I totally get it. And I respect your switching this off and going to go do something else. Thank you, Space Hungarian. I appreciate it. When I first arrived in Ukraine, sort of returning to Ukraine for this NH-17 response, this was really early days in the response, and things were so chaotic with the mission that the car that was supposed to come pick me up, because I'd basically gotten instructions to like get on a plane, pack like 2 days worth of stuff. Nobody told me what I'd be doing. They got all of the Russian speakers in the entire department and packed them onto planes and sent all 4 of us to Kiev from various points. And so I arrive at the airport, and I have no idea where. I've got like the name of the hotel, but like I was kind of told somebody would come and meet me, and that's it. And I get to this airport, and this is like July 2014, so this is like within a week of NH-17 going down or something. So there's almost nobody flying. It's Ukrainians coming home. And I get to the Boryspil airport, and I'm walking around, and there's nobody to meet me that I can find. So I'm just like standing there, this freaking moron, 27-year-old kid, diplomat first time out, and I'm just in this airport in Ukraine. I don't know what to do. Turns out what had happened is the driver they had sent had forgotten the card with my name on it. He had left it back at the headquarters, and had just assumed that he'd be able to spot an Aussie coming off a plane in Kiev airport in June 2014, because it's not like people were coming for holidays. So he was expecting a like 6'3" blonde dude with rippling muscles and a surfboard and like a koala clutching the right side of his, like clutching his bicep. But I kind of looked like absolutely everybody else getting off that plane. So he just kind of stood there, couldn't find me. Anyway, exactly. No Fosters, no didgeridoo, no boomerang. Didn't even have Phil's hammer. So he just kind of left. And I had the name of my hotel, so I'm like, okay, what do? I'll take the, Uber didn't work in Ukraine, at the time. And I certainly didn't have it sort of installed, but there's kind of people offering you rides, sort of, what is, I don't think you're allowed to call them this, but like what sometimes gets called gypsy cabs. I don't think that's the right term, anymore, but that's, basically people who are making money on the side driving. And, a lot of them look fairly dodgy, and I'm fairly scared of everything. But then there's this guy who's maybe 2-3 years younger than me and looks, a good sort, comes up to me and goes, hey, do you need a ride? I'll drive you. I have no idea what the currency conversion rate is. I ask him roughly how much it'll cost to get to where I need to go. He names a figure in hryvnia. I kind of mentally try to do the math of what that is and just go, well, whatever, I need to get there. Take the money out. I get into his, like, it's genuinely pure, Eastern Bloc experience. It's literally like a beaten up larder. But this guy's driving me, seems sort of nice enough, and I'm chatting to him, practice my Russian again. And he's driving me, and we're sort of, obviously it's 2014, you've got to ask guy, how does he feel? This is when the war in Luhansk and Donetsk was really, heating up. This is before, I'll say probably before the Ukrainian army truly kind of managed to reinvent itself a bit and started to make some gains. Things were pretty bad. And sort of asking how he feels about it all. And and he's like, yeah, it's pretty bad, blah, blah, blah. Just worry about my brother. I'm kind of asking him, I'm like, oh, so making polite conversation. Have you been driving this like cab long? And he goes, oh no, I'm just doing it on the weekend to make some money for mum. I'm like, oh, cool. That's nice. What do you do during the week? And he goes, this, and hands me his phone. And on the phone is a picture of him in complete sniper camo. Like the thing where you look like a freaking shrub. He'd just gotten back from the front in Donetsk. And he had literally just been waging war like 2 days ago. And he was going back on Monday. He was just making some money for mum by driving this cab in between literally being on the front. It's just the most intensely kind of incredible thing to be sitting next to a 23-year-old who's just gotten back from the front lines of sort of exchanging fire with separatists and special forces. It was mind-blowing. And then he's driving me through Maidan, which is where the square was, and sort of showing me all of the places where he and everybody else in the country his age had basically faced down riot police, thugs, and bullets, both rubber, and to hold the country together. It was incredible. Some questions, I'll take as many as I can. How useful are so-called charges of Russophobia as a way to prevent clamping down on Russian state influence in British society, politics, property markets, etc.? Yeah, look, I don't think... I think with anything like Russophobia, you cannot simply assume that someone is dodgy because they are Russian, but there are very few ways to make an obscene amount of money in Russia without having ties to the state. And I don't want to libel anybody here, but without perhaps wandering into some areas of intense grey, venturing on black. The Russian economy is built in a large part on state patronage, on sort of government contracts. You need, there's a concept in Russian, dates back sort of decades, called krysha, which literally means roof, where you have somebody who is senior enough in the system that they will run interference on other people that will kind of protect you from the state, and will also protect you from other people's attempts to utilize state organs to mess with you. So all of that basically means that while, Russophobia sort of, I think, was a real thing, especially decades ago when Hollywood was putting out movie after movie about how evil Russians are. I think it's somewhat less of a thing now. But I do think that when it comes to sort of large investments from Russians into the UK, a certain degree of skepticism is warranted and is not necessarily sort of racist or prejudiced, just because if you manage to make a significant amount of money in the Russian Federation, enough that you can sort of buy huge chunks of land in central London, it is probably not illegitimate to ask about the extent to which you are connected to President Vladimir Putin and his regime, his coterie, the people around him, and what you have basically done to make that money. It's also not kind of irresponsible to ask what kind of hold Putin's regime may still have on you, depending on where your existing assets in Russia are, say, situated, where your families and so on. So I don't think like throwing around charges of Russophobia is hugely helpful in preventing it, because I think you can sort of separate those two out a bit. Then there's a question from Chris 50. For those who sort of haven't been aware of their history since early 2014, can I give a rundown? I guess I'll do my best. I'm not a historian of Ukraine, so this is kind of half remembered, half understood things. And if there are people in the chat who understand this stuff better, please jump in. I've got more passion than knowledge, so please feel free to kind of correct me, interrupt me, give your own takes. But very, very basically, Ukraine under its then president had been negotiating for a while a treaty with the European Union, effectively an economic cooperation treaty. At the last moment, having kind of ignored its evolution, I would say, for a while, the Kremlin started applying intense pressure on this president, who was, let's face it, a corrupt Russian puppet anyway, to basically not sign it and instead sign a cooperation agreement with Russia that would move Ukraine closer to the EAUA, the Eurasian Economic Union, which is like Russia's weird mirror of the European Union that they're kind of forming with some of the former republics, but not really, because they kind of abolished the borders, but they didn't. It's a whole thing. So basically got him to tear up the EU cooperation agreement, at the last minute, and instead move sort of pivot eastward. A bunch of people went out onto the streets of Kiev and other cities and other places in Ukraine to protest this. There'd always been a movement of people who wanted Ukraine to move in a more westerly direction, who wanted a more European Ukraine. Initially, this was overwhelmingly students and young people. The sort of, I mean, in the same way that most protests anywhere are like, generally, there's a core of students and activists and young people who tend to just protest more than others. And they sort of, they went to Maidan Square, and to protest this, there were like tens of thousands of them, but tens, not hundreds. And basically the regime massively, overreacted. The regime freaked out and overreacted and called in the Birkut. Birkut is it's the best way to explain it is like if the Home Office or the Office of Internal Affairs, whatever you guys have in your country, had its own dedicated, almost semi-paramilitary police force that was dedicated to maintaining internal order. I mean, there's like some parallels to like the French gendarmerie versus the police, but it doesn't really translate, except that these guys were, basically brutal thugs. These guys were often hired from rural and provincial provinces where there weren't a lot of work, but they also didn't know anybody in Kiev or Lviv or any of these, or Kharkiv or any of these cities, so they would have no problem beating the hell out of them. And so basically they deployed an obscene amount of these guys and police onto the streets. They kettled the hell out of the protesters. They denied them any way out, and then they basically just laid into them with batons, metal pipes, whatever they had at hand. That a lot of people got very, 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 very injured. If you want to learn more about this, I think it should still be on Netflix. There's a fantastic documentary called Winter on Fire, where it's got quite a lot of footage that was taken from there. Absolutely kind of heartbreaking scenes of literally like male students forming rows like 8 deep with the female students in the middle, basically just hoping the Berkut will get tired by the time they're done breaking the bones of the males, to be too tired to beat the crap out of the women. It's horrific stuff. But basically, the next day, there were like 800,000 people on the streets of Kiev, because it had just been such a massive and brutal overreaction. A whole bunch of people just watched a bunch of kids get beaten to death, basically, live on cell phones. And what followed was Euromaidan, which was sort of an extended kind of demi-siege of the center of Kiev and other places that ultimately forced out the Ukrainian president, and who fled. They then broke into his ridiculous manor with like his zoo and his giant boat. He basically fled to Russia, and Ukraine became a kind of more functioning democracy with a whole bunch of problems. At the same time, in response to this, basically a bunch of things happened, but in fairly rapid succession, there were effectively uprisings in Luhansk and Donetsk, which are two of the easternmost provinces of Ukraine, where a lot of the traditional heavy industry and a lot of the mining had tended to be. These were fueled by a combination, it's really hard to unpick why people did this, but basically it was a combination of a couple of things. Life there had apparently been pretty bad. The provincial governors were corrupt, just this side of banditry, and so were robbing the population blind. The industry and the mining in that part of Ukraine was massively underinvested in, which means it was brutal, awful work that also didn't pay very well, but seemed to be making other people rich. These guys had all been watching Russian TV nonstop, and Russian TV makes Fox News look balanced and sort of inept at propaganda. And they'd also been consistently told that this new regime in Kiev were fascist Ukrainian nationalists who were going to ban the Russian language and round them all up and force them to speak Ukrainian and to forsake all connections to Russia and so on. So that there were kind of uprisings there with an indeterminate amount of Russian mercenaries and special forces and operatives boosting it. At the same time, Russia basically just took Crimea. A bunch of special forces just seized every major point in Crimea in a ultimately a fairly bloodless coup, because they were just there one day. There were just armored personnel carriers blocking the bridge out and special forces manning them. And Ukraine's military at the time was in absolutely no position to kind of really fight anybody. A lot of the officer corps had been Russian and had kind of fled. Everything was in chaos. The army was largely useless. And so Ukraine began, while it was trying to rebuild, fighting this battle with these kind of armed separatists in the east. Not so much Crimea, because they didn't want to pick a fight directly with the Russian Federation, but with these two kind of self-declared independent republics of the Luhansk and Donetsk. They began what they called a counterterrorism operation to wage war with them. Initially, in terms of Western involvement or whatever, while there had been condemnations of Crimea, things were actually, I think Putin's plan was working quite well in that things were so murky. Things were so kind of confused around who's the good guys in Donetsk, who's the bad guys, what's going on. That basically the West didn't know who to back and was kind of just umming and eyeing. And then MH17 got shot down, and really governments all over the West swung in behind Ukraine. Might stop the narrative there and answer Clara Saxon's question. I mean, the question is, criticism on the Bulwark, which is a US Never Trumper podcast. It's also a publication, I think, the Bulwark, with like Tim and some of these other guys. And basically the argument is that, Zelensky was talking down the threat of invasion, and the Ukrainians were kind of carrying on as normal, and now he's accusing NATO of appeasement, and is this fair? Really complicated to say. You have to appreciate Zelensky's an impossible situation, because you think about what's going on in Ukraine, what was going on until like 3 hours ago, right? Putin essentially had just conducted massive military exercises still firmly on his own territory. So he had put a bunch of troops on military exercises and in offensive deployment positions, but still on military exercises in across the Ukrainian eastern border, its northern border in Belarus, even activated some of the troops in Transnistria and in Moldova. But basically, he hadn't invaded anybody afresh yet. I mean, there have been Russian soldiers fighting in Luhansk and Donetsk forever, but in terms of like a fresh invasion, he hadn't done anything yet. And so from Zelensky's perspective, he's got, on the one hand, he's got this like sort of Damocles hanging over him in the form of somewhere between 150 and 200,000 Russian troops on his borders. On the other hand, Putin hasn't actually done anything yet. And so Zelensky is watching investment in his economy kind of turn off. He's watching entire airlines cancel all flights to Kiev. He's watching people flee and and Putin hadn't done anything yet. So he's got to balance kind of how to prevent anything being done with not creating a situation where all Putin has to do to collapse the Ukrainian economy or to freeze the Ukrainian economy in stasis is to conduct large exercises. Because if that's the signal you send, if like every time Putin moves a bunch of troops to the border, everybody in Ukraine panics, all commerce shuts down, everybody kind of leaves, or everybody who can flies off to the west, all shops are closed and so on, then that is a pretty strong incentive to keep doing it. Because remember, for Putin, like a successful Ukraine is really not a good policy outcome for a whole bunch of reasons. So Zelensky's got to kind of deal with that, but at the same time, he obviously understands that the threat is real. So I think a lot of his messaging up until like Munich and today was like, first of all, like we haven't been invaded. Everybody needs to calm down because he's got to try to preserve his economy. Secondly, a lot of his messaging was like, you can see what he's doing. You can see what he's been doing to us for 8 years. Sanction him already. Don't wait for something else. Like if the lesson is you're not allowed to destabilize your neighbors and like shell your neighbors and send troops into your neighboring country, he's been doing that the whole time. Sanction him right now. And so that was his message until today when they just crossed the borders. And so now his nightmare scenario from Zelensky's point of view is, okay, does the West look at this and say, well, at the end of the day, is Luhansk and Donetsk a relatively small price for peace? Like that's his thing. And he was doing that while he was watching Macron and others go over there and basically dangle this various ideas of like reformulating or respecting Minsk, basically this idea that there might be a trade that can happen where Ukraine vows to never join NATO, Luhansk and Donetsk becomes de facto sovereign, and all of these concessions are made, and that lets everybody go home and feel like everybody's won, when in fact all you've done is buy Putin off until he wants more concessions. So I don't think it's an entirely fair criticism of Zelensky. I love my never Trump brethren, but you guys managed to lose control of your party forever to idiot charlatan. So maybe shut the fuck up forever about everything. Yeah. I mean, the whole NATO expansion thing I find quite funny, because, I'm always tempted to go, okay, so if you think that the threat is net expansion is a problem, how many countries do you guys think would have to be in NATO before NATO attacked Russia? Before NATO contemplated attacking Russia? There are 195 countries in the UN, 194. Russia's one of them. I mean, Russia's got a fully functional nuclear triad. Subs, planes, missiles. Pretty big country. Not a lot of successful invasions of Russia historically, and do they really have anything anybody really wants to invade? What's the actual threat? Oh, there could be missiles in slightly closer to Russia. Okay. Well, if they're ever launched, you can burn the world 15 times over. Got one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. Anyway, didn't make a huge amount of sense to me. So question from Starlight, in the financial sector, beyond sanctions being announced today, is there anything that can be done to tackle Russian money laundering by the city? Or is there no political will for it? I think there might be political will for it now. Just cause it's kind of just tipped the point. It's past that tipping point where I think people may actually be interested in doing something about it. There's a huge amount that can be done. I mean, they are laundering money. They are also Russian oligarchs, including a lot of people in Putin's circle, are using the West, including London and the city, as a store of wealth beyond access. Rather than they're buying up property and they're using it to store wealth. That's their nest eggs abroad. One of the most infuriating things about Putin's Russia is how many of the people actively destroying it don't seem to want to hang out there too much. Yeah, okay, so good kind of, so yes, there is absolutely, absolutely things that you could do, to pursue a lot of these assets, to get much more robust about money laundering, to get much more robust around, shell companies, to get much more robust about cutting off financial ties, to the West, not letting these guys access credit, not letting these guys, take their mistresses shopping, on George Street or whatever. There's absolutely things that you could do to make the lives of people in Putin's orbit and that are part of his power structure and the pyramid on which he's kind of built his regime significantly more uncomfortable. Can you collapse the Russian economy? No, probably not. Even if you blow up Nord Stream 2, which, for the record, I mean, you don't have to blow it up, but just don't buy gas from Russia and buy it. It's not like the pipeline's not the problem, it's the contracts at the end of it. So you can certainly hurt Russia considerably by tackling by no longer buying their energy resources. But you can't collapse the Russian economy too much, although you can collapse their stock market, and which is already happening, and you can mess with their financial sector and their ability to get money in. But so there's things you can do. Yes, there was this sort of idea that Russia might join NATO in the late 90s and 2000s. That was very much pre-Putin, when everybody thought Russia was going to be our kind of everybody's friend. Ibarso Kate, butchering that. Yes, Putin's concerned about regime change, but like, I know Russia likes to pretend that like the entirety of Maidan was a US black op or like a George Soros op, but like if the US had the ability in this day and age to change regimes in countries that powerful at will, I probably see the world would look different. Like this idea that the Cold War lasted, God, 50 years, decades after that, the idea that we could just like replace Putin, probably the richest man on earth, including Elon Musk, just in terms of hidden assets, with the entirety of the state, like, afraid of regime. The US has no ability to regime change, and Russia, neither does NATO, neither does anybody. Not even, and that's even setting aside, who would follow him and the horrors of that. So, I mean, yes, it's what he's concerned about. They all live in paranoid delusion that the US is going to come mess with things in their country. But, I mean, it's just paranoid and just kind of sad. Auto-peep questions about Putin's mental state. Is it a weird rationalization? God, I don't know. Like you watch the press conference, and sometimes, certainly, I think the thing that I listen to is that if you compare his speech now compared to his speech in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, it's less coherent, more all over the place, more extreme, more rambling. Do I think he has literally lost his mind? I don't. I don't think so. I think it's a convenient rationalization. And again, from his perspective, a lot of what he's doing kind of probably makes sense. It's not, in terms of, if you accept his fundamental position, which is that a stable, prosperous, and Western-aligned Ukraine on his border is a threat to his regime, not because CIA infiltrators are going to walk, from Lviv to Kharkiv into Russia and then overthrow him, but just because he really doesn't like the counterexample. This idea that if you have a massively corrupt, strongman Russian leader, you can overthrow him in a color revolution and then turn your country into a better direction. That's not a great, that is not a great precedent from his perspective, and it's one that he doesn't want in place. So I think it's comfortable to just go, he's just insane, but I don't think that's what's going on. We're von Zuzimhus, I think I got that right, asks, do you think Macron will benefit domestically from his diplomacy? Generally, a comment on Macron's actions would be appreciated. Yeah, listen, I have no idea how French politics works. I don't think anybody does. But certainly nobody in the West, and I don't want to be one of those, like, observer or spectator columnists being like, I have read one article, so here is what I think will happen in the French election. Certainly, I think, having done all of that shuttle diplomacy and had the Russians still effectively invade is not the outcome I suspect Macron wanted. I think what Macron was kind of banking on was, if Putin hadn't ever planned to invade or was reconsidering invasion or could in any way be talked down of invasion, then Macron could afterwards very credibly say that he played a role in the diplomatic maneuvering to make that happen. And he could present himself as a statesman and someone who's taken very seriously on the world stage and someone who kind of forged peace in Europe, at least temporarily. That I think was his gamble. I don't think it necessarily panned out quite that way. I would also say that it did come off as insufferably arrogant. And I say that as, I'm hashtag neoliberal. I'm not somebody who just reflexively hates Macron for everything he stands for, but I do think this kind of like, I will fix it by having a conversation with Putin and then agreeing to things with him that I will then take to others without really understanding their positions, and I will just fix it all, was, it's particularly enlightened, and does come off as somewhat sort of arrogant. French voters do demand swagger. It's quite funny. I've talked about this before, but I think it's fascinating how French voters, how some countries' voters want some countries' voters want like a leader you can look up to, they can look up to, and that's got swagger, that's cool, whereas others want a leader that they can kind of look down on, which is sort of more of an Australian thing. But yeah, I think it was a kind of bold move, and it was a bold roll of the dice, that I think would have really paid dividends for him if it had worked. And honestly, if he'd come up with some third way solution that actually would have worked, more power to him. And I don't think you get to be president of France or president of anything without a really healthy ego. If you don't think you have the solutions that nobody else has, you don't run for president, right? Like you don't put yourself out there as I can lead a G7 nation. Exactly. I think that's Sefka. I think your point's spot on. Looking at kind of more questions. I don't know that sort of comparing the 6 hours Macron spent with Putin compared to Boris's phone call is necessarily fully reflective of the comparative sort of position of the powers. We don't, because the counterfactual is how much time does Putin give him if Boris flies over there? Which he didn't do. So first of all, like, he wasn't present, he wasn't there. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think they were positioning themselves very differently. Macron was there sort of in a self-proclaimed role trying to broker a compromise solution, whereas I think both Liz Truss and Boris Johnson saw their role as sending a message. So they were trying to send a de-escalation message, or whatever you want to call it. They were there to basically say, these sanctions are serious, do not do this. And to reiterate that kind of stick. Whereas Macron was there to kind of negotiate. And that inherently gets you more time. Just looking at this, yes, so right now there have been the intention to apply sanctions announced. I think the US, the EU, France, the UK have all announced that they will take some sanctions actions. Most modern sanctions these days will target individuals and firms rather than sort of nations. It's less like you can't sell us cheese anymore, and more like these particular people or these particular business entities are now on a do not do business list, and so all US firms are now not allowed to do business with these companies. And if they do, they face massive fines. So basically what you do through these sanctions is that you effectively shut off your market and all of the actors in it to selected entities on the other side. And the extent of the escalations of really good questions, like how far can you go with this, is basically depends on the number of entities that you target on their side and the extent of the sanctions, basically. So a bunch of questions coming in. I think Brutus 2525's point about Russian false flag operations is 100% right. They've been doing this for decades. Like the fabricating attacks in order to create some sort of cover and casus belli has been a trick they've been pulling forever. They've pulled it in Georgia over and over again. They've pulled it with the Chechen separatists. They keep doing it. I think what changed this time was firstly, like, I don't know if there's been a degradation of Russian intelligence, as in the intelligence services, not the intellect, not the intellect of individual Russians, but the intelligence services over the past year, or if they've just gotten incredibly lazy. See you, Christopher. Thanks for coming. But all of these provocations look incredibly lazy and incredibly half-assed. Like, they keep packing the same incredibly cheap four-wheel drives from like 1970 with explosives and blowing them up in front of camera crews and being like, oh, it's terrorism attacks. Today they claim that like the Ukrainian army had sent 2 armored personnel carriers into Russia with a sabotage mission. Like, if you wanted to cross a border, covertly, you would send 2 infantry fighting vehicles weighing like 14 tons each and making enough noise to be heard from space. It's just, they were barely even trying. The funniest, I mean, exactly, 70s UAZs got blown up. The funniest was they claimed that there'd been a car bomb basically placed under the vehicle of I think it was the Luhansk, leader, the Donetsk, leader, but they didn't actually want to blow up his car because it's kind of nice. So they took the plates off and they put it on one of these 70 UAZ's cars and blew that up instead. And there's just photos of the license plate. It's just, I mean, these guys aren't barely even trying anymore. And I think they haven't known exactly how to react to Western intelligence's new plan of just releasing everything they know constantly. I don't think Simone, I don't think it's actually easier to spot and debunk now necessarily. I just think there's been a new policy of like, as soon as we hear about it, or as soon as we hear it's coming, we announce it. So everybody's much more vigilant for it. And he hasn't been able to split the West the same way. So yeah, the signing ceremony with the separatists was 10 hours long. The treaty is like dozens of pages long and has been written ages ago. They've clearly been planning this forever. And they haven't really known how to react to the Western intelligence's new plan of just making that really obvious, rather than like refuting it in a huff afterwards. The preemptive intelligence stuff, I think, has thrown them for a loop a bit, but they've also just gotten super lazy. Sorry, just gonna scroll up to some of the questions we got before, because I think they were really, really good. Question from Joffrey of Monmouth was asked, do you think the Conservative Party's reliance on Russian donations will compromise the UK's will to enact the most effective sanctions possible? I don't think so, to be very honest. I know that would be fun. And I think what it will preclude is them leaning into like a big a like wide cross-party investigation of Russian money in public life. They won't want that, I suspect, because they won't like what it turns up, and it's going to be embarrassing for them. But I don't think it'll actually prevent them from doing things like rolling out sanctions or even fighting Russian money, just because a lot of the Russian money they've been getting is so entrenched in the system that I don't think it's going to get pulled out by a review like this. There are Russians in the House of Lords that are funding them, and those guys aren't going anywhere. It's also just in terms of, ultimately, as much as they like money and donations, they like votes more, and the downside risk of being seen to go soft on your donors, given the recent scandals they've had, I suspect, and God, don't prove me wrong, Boris, that they will want to be, if anything, they will want to demonstrate that they're not subject to Russian money, and they'll go the other way. Maybe I'm hopelessly naive. Also, I don't necessarily think that UK politics works the same way as US politics, in the sense that I don't know that, I think your system is less reliant, and individual, like, MPs are less reliant on donations than congressmen are in the US. So buying influence is a little bit harder. A little bit harder in the UK, I think, than it is in the US, where every congressman needs to raise like $30,000 a week in order to finance their re-election bid, and so is kind of forever at the mercy of those who are capable of writing those kind of checks to super PACs. More questions. I mean, Putin's line that Ukraine is a US colony with a puppet regime is just, I mean, So the exact quote from Clara Sachs has got it here. Ukraine is a US colony with a puppet regime that has never had a tradition of genuine statehood. Modern Ukraine was created by Russia. I mean, apart from everything else, it's really, really funny to say something like that when you've just occupied Belarus and basically at gunpoint got the president to be like, oh no, you guys can stay forever. And also, yes, by all means, use our country as a potential staging point for an invasion. Yes, sir. Like, it's just kind of a little bit absurd to talk for Russia to talk about anywhere as colonies and puppet regimes, when it's kind of desperately propping up strongmen in Belarus and in Kazakhstan, and everywhere with basically just troops and armed thugs. Did Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian, like, rule of law, Ukrainian society have a long way to go? Does it have a long way to go? Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, democracies are a hard thing to build, and so are stable, robust institutions where people believe in the rule of law. They believe that sort of the rules are there to be obeyed, and it's good to pay your taxes, and it's sort of smart to follow the rules, and it's good not to steal from work and steal from the state. All these things take a while to build. Corruption was a huge problem in the Soviet Union. It continued to be a huge problem in Ukraine. Under the pre-Maidan governments, it continues to be a huge problem in Ukraine to this day, and it's one that, some Ukrainian journalists are really critical of Zelensky for not having tackled properly. Zelensky's, I don't know how much you guys know about Zelensky. I don't know if you guys have ever watched his actual show. It's called Servant of the People. And it's a weird fiction becomes reality thing where it's a comedy where he plays a school teacher who, on the eve of an election, is asked by his students who he would vote for. And he goes on a rant about how all of the parties are massively corrupt, that they don't work for the people, that they just employ their, like, families, and that all of them are worthless, and kind of goes on this long rant. And one of the students has a cell phone and records it and puts it on YouTube, and then basically enrolls him as the candidate for president, like, as a joke. And then he ends up becoming president of Ukraine. And then that's like the premise of his show. And then all of that kind of happened. But he ran on an anti-corruption platform and as a kind of new face. And there's some people say kind of not living up to that. But it's just an incredibly difficult thing to do. Yeah, I mean, Marco Mouse, yeah, I mean, it's like I don't know if we got complacent here in the West, that we, like, thought hundreds of tanks crossing borders was a thing of the past. Like, in Europe, at least. In Europe, in North America. Yes, Yugoslavia happened, but that was kind of, 24 years ago? Yeah, and we'll probably never see anything like a coalition of the willing, I don't think anybody's super willing to follow the US into another Middle Eastern adventure anytime soon, and frankly, not too bummed about that. So, I mean, is that order over? Can you draw some solace from the fact that Putin is at least trying to maintain a fig leaf of deniability? that it sort of what we're seeing is not yet interdiction strikes in Kiev, that it's just tanks rolling into. I mean, I don't want to justify any of it as okay, but like, is that something we can kind of, they're at least pretending that order of you don't launch wars of aggression against your neighbors, like he's still pretending that's still there. He's just sending in peacekeepers. But it's, I mean, you're right, it's just, this is a new thing. So, some really great questions here. Gonna do Enzo Face's question first, just because I haven't answered one of his yet, I think. Or hers, I'm so sorry. Shouldn't assume. How does the Russian disinformation adjust to a scenario where global media agencies are scrutinizing every tidbit of information? Really, really good question. I suspect that they will pivot. So the initial play is you try to justify it at home and you try to spread confusion in the West. You basically try to do what you did with Georgia, where you make everything so murky and you make the absence of good guys, clear good guys and bad guys. You make it all so confusing that the entire West puts it all in the too hard basket and just issues statements of condemnation and just goes away and lives away. That's what the goal of like the propaganda in the West is. That's what RT's working on. That's what, Stop the War Coalition appear to be working on. I'm not saying they're Russian agents. I just think they're not helping. But that's kind of plan. That's the foreign plan. The domestic plan is he's got to convince the Russian people that what he's doing is measured and balanced. And he's not just killing Ukrainians for the sake of it. It's kind of really really important to remember that, like, at least in Western Russia, like, everybody knows lots of Ukrainians. It's not like it's some distant other. I think the US got away with some of its wars in the Middle East because, like, people from Iraq are very distant from the minds of, most Americans have probably never met an Iraqi. Oh, cool! I can buy followers, primes, and viewers. That's fantastic. Buy it with an NFT as well. I wonder if I can just ban this person. Oh, I know how Twitch works. So domestically, he's got to basically convince them that he's being rational, that Ukrainians are bad and fascist and killing Russians. So I think the propaganda is just going to pivot domestically. It's going to stop being about the international audience, though I'm sure they'll sort of keep trying, but it's going to much more pivot to basically explaining to Russian people why potentially some of their soldiers are coming back in body bags and why this was the right thing to do. That's my suspicion of how Russian disinfo is going to handle Western global media agencies scrutinizing every tidbit of information. They're just going to start ignoring them and pivoting and knowing that Russian state news, and it's all state news, will take it on face value and run with it 24/7. There was another really good question from Styles M4. What's Russia's potential diplomatic actions in the next few days? Yeah, I mean, that's a $10 billion question. I've seen some analysis that suggests that China has kind of overplayed its hand and accidentally sent Russia a stronger signal about cooperation than it had perhaps intended to. Because if the Chinese government believes in one thing above all others, it is that an ethnically homogeneous state within an ethnically homogeneous territory within a national government should not be able to declare independence, especially with the assistance of foreign powers, because for them that is Tibet, that is Taiwan to an extent, that is a lot of things. So I think I suspect the Chinese will not be thrilled about the extent to which this was escalated. But in terms of their diplomatic moves, I can't imagine it rises to the level of sanctions. I would imagine what we're going to see is a lot of like calls for a peaceful solution and to be able to get back to the negotiating table. It'll be interesting. It'll be really interesting to see this. I don't pretend to be a sinologist. There are some really interesting people you guys can follow for the Chinese response. I mean, the UN Security Council emergency meetings can be cute, but Russia's a permanent member. So they're going to yell at each other, but there's not going to be any resolutions coming out of any of this, out of a Security Council meeting. So, it'll be a chance actually to see the Chinese rhetoric there will be really interesting. Because on the one hand, they sort of don't like Western encroachment on the borders of states. On the other hand, they really don't like the idea that sort of subnational groups within a country's territory can declare independence. Yeah, it's fine. So there are other questions. I'm sorry, I can't keep up with the chat sometimes. What do you think is the future for Nord Stream 2? I mean, God, at this point, if at this point Germany doesn't massively invest in divesting, I don't know. Like at that point, like, well, what do you do? What other clearer symbols do you need? I can't imagine that Scholz will be able to activate it anytime soon. So I think I can't imagine they'll actually dismantle it, but I suspect what's going to happen is they will just simply not activate it. The real question is more like what happens with Nord Stream 1. What happens with the existing Russian sales of gas to Germany and Europe? Does Europe continue to buy them? Do the sanctions, as I think it was the Spanish were saying, the Spanish wanted to exempt the energy sector from sanctions. It's like, cool. It's like sanctioning Saudi Arabia, but exempting oil. Like, congratulations. You're really smashing their, like, gourmet cheese sales. Yeah, I think it was Draghi. I think they've since kind of walked it back a bit. So, up at 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the like $10 million question. What border is Putin recognizing? Is it the whole of the two oblasts? Is it the OAC line of contact? Is it that kind of line that goes all the way past Mariupol, all the way south? We don't know yet. I suspect at the moment they are pushing the peacekeepers up to the existing borders, like literally where the two lines of troops are, and we'll basically see what happens next. Because there's basically no way you can, like, Ukraine holds 2/3 of both those oblasts. Everything, the separatists hold, or rebels, whatever you want to call them, Russia basically holds the chunk with the two capital cities, but still like a third of the country on the southeastern side. So there's really no way you can push that further west without directly engaging Ukrainian dug-in positions, which almost certainly means like airstrikes, helicopters, tank battles. That's a really significant step of escalation. Whereas he can basically do this, like Russian troops have crossed the border, but right now they're still effectively driving in territory they've controlled the entire time. Or they've controlled since 2014. Like it's part of Ukraine, but it's been in separatist hands, which means the Russian hands. So far they can kind of do it without literally driving head on into a dug-in Ukrainian infantry division. You can't do that with the full size of the oblast. So God, I mean, if I knew that, I wish I knew that, but I don't know. Enzoface, your question to Germany's choice to decommission nuclear power early made this war more likely. I don't know if it made it more likely, but it certainly decreased Western leverage. I don't understand that decision. I don't understand that decision from an environmental standpoint, from a safety standpoint, from a geopolitical standpoint. Like, even if Russia didn't exist, and Germany had simply shut down its nuclear power plants to rely more on gas from, like, I don't know, Lithuania, it would still be a really baffling and kind of stupid reaction to Fukushima, which had been built on a fault line, melting down. Germany's nuclear power plants aren't built on fault lines. Like, it was just baffling decision from an environmental standpoint, from an energy security standpoint, and like quadruply so from an energy standpoint. And Germany was just hopelessly naive over and over again. Yeah, I mean, light switch. I mean, they're not peacekeepers. It's just the army. Like, it's just an occupying force. They were kind of an occupying force the entire time. They're, I mean, you can call them whatever you want. You don't get to send advanced elements of what is basically a combination of your mercenaries and your special forces into a country, seize a part of it, dress up some locals, get them to invite you in, and declare the whole thing to be peacekeeping. Like, I mean, come on. Yeah, they're not peacekeepers. It's an invasion. It's an occupying force. And they're going to kind of keep the peace only in the sense that Ukraine's going to be even more reluctant to kind of ever consider taking back its own territory than they were before. But no, peacekeepers. Yeah. So the question's in order. Could Russia leverage the Iran deal over the Ukraine issue? I don't know. I would suspect that just about everything's on the table. Now. I think Iran pretty badly wants its assets unfrozen. It wants the ability to trade back and wants some level of normalization of economic relations. So the question is, if Russia doesn't sign, can you roll it? Can you kind of roll on with an Iran deal without it? I don't know. I'm not an expert on the Iran deal in any way, shape, or form. Beyond sanctions, how else can the EU respond? Massive aid packages to Ukraine, like massive, has got to be the answer. Because right now the question is, if you because remember, Putin doesn't actually think NATO expansion is ever going to happen. So that's not what it's about. And I don't think he cares that much about this territory. Like, Luhansk and Donetsk aren't. So, I mean, he basically controlled them already, and they're not so amazingly lucrative that, like, he desperately wants them. This isn't 1939 and Germany's after Lebensraum, for the Volk. He's taking this in large part to destabilize Ukraine. His ideal scenario is that this, combined with everything else he's doing, somehow destabilizes the Ukrainian government to the point where it collapses, and he can then have a regime in Ukraine that is sort of more in the mold of the pre-Maidan sort of Russian-friendly client state government as there is in Belarus. Yeah, the EU is absolutely not empowered to give Ukraine nukes back. It's probably for the best. Though, yeah, I mean, would this have happened if Ukraine had nukes? I don't know. Salami tactics is a thing. Yeah, George Friedman is good. So he was asking Lightswitch 21 in terms of stuff to read. I really recommend my friend's International Intrigue is very good. This is run by two former friends of mine, who are former diplomats, putting sort of long postings in China, who's really good on this kind of stuff. Rob Lee is incredible. There's a really good, let me see if I can find the link for you guys. There's a really good list somebody put together, Anders Ostland put together a list called, okay, see if you guys can copy this. So this list there, it's got amazing resources on the entire Russia crisis. About 326 accounts this is my go-to list, these days of things that I follow on Ukraine. Some really, really good posters in there. Sorry, it's going down the list. Zelensky address is about to start. Yeah. We have 3 viable solutions for how Russia could stop how NATO could stop Russia. Do any of them involve bombing the Kremlin? See if I can find the Zelensky address. Hopefully I can find it. Happy to see if I can watch it for you guys. Okay, it's on his Twitter yet. No, it's all from days ago. Do you have a link to it? Okay, nasty 666. Hit us with them. What do you got? And Roman von Zimhausen, if you've got a link to Zelensky's speech, could you throw it into chat? There's some really good journalism coming out of Ukraine too. Some really good sort of freelancers and stuff that have been on the ground forever. Sorry, still trying to find this address if I can. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental thing is we don't know what the next stage of this is. We don't know that at all. We don't know if the tanks are going to stop once they reach the existing line of demarcation. We don't know how many have gone in. We don't know how Ukraine will respond militarily. So I don't think 1 would fix it. I think 2 would be quite funny. And I think 3, abolishing NATO because it's useless post-Cold War. I think the last week has shown maybe not so much. I think if I were in Estonia or Latvia, I would not necessarily think that NATO is useless at the moment. Okay, so it looks like his speech is going to start in 6.5 minutes or so. So what I might try to do is see if I can stream it for you guys. Or rather stream it with you guys. I suspect it might be in Ukrainian, which is a challenge. But because even I don't speak Ukrainian, but we will absolutely see what we can do. Alright, and then the desktop. And then desktop audio. Alright, well let's see if that works when the time comes. We're looking at the same feed. Be interesting to see what language he actually does this in. And whether they do run translation. I suspect he's got to do it in Ukrainian to address his own people. But that will start, for those of you who can't see it, that will start in 5 minutes. Sitting up there. Hide that for now. I'm glad this is your favorite chat. I'm sorry my country had to be a little bit invaded for you to find a great chat. Yeah, really good question, Katotum88, about the extent to which hitting Russia with massive sanctions now removes escalatory potential if Russian tanks don't stop at the border. A really, really good question. So I'll kind of front up to this. I was one of the people who would defend the argument that you shouldn't slap, until today, was saying that no, don't hit him with sanctions because you want there to be consequences for crossing the border. I wasn't like 100% sure on that, but I could understand what the argument was. I could understand Biden's argument and Macron's argument. The argument of others, I understood why they weren't doing it. Now that it's happened, now that he has crossed the border, I think the lesson we now have is that the threat of sanctions is not a final deterrent. And so I'm like, now there's got to be consequences, because we drew a red line. The West drew a red line, and he's moonwalked across it. He's literally driven tanks across the red line. So, the question is, how hard can you hit him? Do you leave anything left in the tank? There are options like you do everything short of pulling the Russian banking system from SWIFT. There are always ways you can escalate sanctions. But my sense is hit him and hit him hard, because the red line's been crossed. And if all you do now is hold off on sanctions and say, oh, no, I know we said this was the red line, but the red line's actually this. You can't, when we said don't invade Ukraine, what we meant was, the haggling is dumb. Ukraine has a border. It's a border recognized by everybody from the United Nations through the Russian ambassador. The Russian ambassador to the US 24 hours ago was saying absolutely nobody questions Luhansk and Donetsk are part of Ukraine. But this was 24 hours ago. The idea that the border has permanently now shifted to wherever the current battle lines between Russian-supported separatists and Ukraine happen to be today is just not how borders work. Arguing what crossing the border means. Columns of tanks are driving into the country. The fact that they're driving onto territory that Russian special forces, mercenaries, and bandits, together with some local sympathizers, have managed to pre-invade doesn't make it stop being Ukrainian territory. Just come on. There's 1 minute until this speech. I think I don't know if we're gonna get news. I'm gonna try to watch this. Hopefully it has subtitles. If the subtitles are at least in Russian, I can do my best to try to translate. If there are no subtitles at all, probably won't subject you guys to a long speech in Ukrainian. But we'll see if we can find a translation somewhere. Okay, so it's saying it's under a minute. Let's see what happens here. I'm gonna whack these headphones on so I can hear them too. I'm glad you guys have enjoyed some of the gaming content as well. That is much less intense than tonight's stream, but just as fun. You will absolutely learn nothing about gaming from watching me. So if you're concerned you'll become a gamer by osmosis. You have nothing to worry about. I can't imagine can you imagine giving this speech that Zelensky's about to have to give? What can you possibly say? Yeah. A hot tub stream and so face. Just, yes, it's my future flashing before my eyes. But the thing is, I know you're kidding about copying the speech from Independence Day this morning, but in some ways, he can't even give that speech because it's not like he's about to push. Like, I don't think he's about to say they're going to go invade they're not going to start a counter assault to push these invading Russians out. So it's not even a fight them on the beaches thing. It's a this is unacceptable, but what can we do about what can we possibly do about it? Okay, they've just said 10 seconds until broadcast. If my Ukrainian's okay. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine's tanks are from the 70s. A lot of countries' tanks are quite old. Military equipment doesn't, you buy military equipment for decades. Obviously Russian tanks are newer, but to be very honest, Russian air superiority is going to, in any sort of open conflict, Russian air superiority is going to be so extreme, and so dominant, that big Ukrainian tech it doesn't matter how old it is. They're just going to light it up. So I think it's much more about it's going to be much more about infantry and sort of partisan warfare and resistance. There will absolutely not be a no-fly zone enforced. Absolutely no way. Nobody is, because the only ones that could enforce, even theoretically enforce a no-fly zone is the entirety of NATO working together. And there we go.
Тож я не буду говорити про минуле, скажу про реалії і майбутнє. За мною Україна у її міжнародно визнаних кордонах. І вони залишаться такими. Попри все, попри будь-які заяви та дії Російської Федерації. Так само, як і ми залишаємось спокійними і впевненими у собі. За це я хочу подякувати всім вам, наші громадяни. Ви вкотре доводите, українці розумна і мудра нація. І попри все зберігає холодну голову, реагує.
Sorry guys, well that was a bust. Really hoping to watch that. If we can find a translation somewhere, I'd recommend you watch it. I mean, it doesn't look like he's emotionally collapsing, which is nice. Yeah, I mean, Iraqi tanks versus US everything. It was incredibly one-sided. They would find them in the middle of snowstorms and blow them up. I think, to be fair, I think Russian helicopters may have a slightly harder time than US ones did, just because absolutely everybody has been shipping javelins and anti manpads to to Ukraine for the last few weeks. So it's got a hell of a lot of ways to shoot down a helicopter, at least, even if they don't have a lot to counter sort of more strategic aviation. But yeah, it's yeah, I mean, it's still tech's not going to stand much of a chance. It's going to be about infantry. So very tempted to pause this discussion about the invasion of Ukraine to explain e-girls to Styles M4. But you know what? I don't think that's a good pivot for this stream. Yeah, I mean, there's just not a lot you can honestly say. We don't know where they'll stop. We don't know what the right reaction will be. We don't know what can be done, if anything. And very honestly, because just like Georgia before it, just like a lot of other places, the question a lot of people in Ukraine would be asking themselves right now is, when does the West move on? When does the West lose interest? When does the West decide that the ultimate interest of reforging some sort of working relationship? Oh no, I don't think there's, I mean, God, please don't prove me wrong, life, but I don't think there's ever been a discussion of him occupying the entire country. I think there has been the most dire scenarios kind of said he gets all the way to Kiev, and he occupies Kiev. Even I, frankly, somewhat question his ability to hold Kiev for very long. I just like trying to fight a motivated counterinsurgency in a place where everybody speaks your language, looks exactly like you, and is also sort of urban. I think is, yeah, so it's interesting about this being internal driven, because unlike with Crimea, the Russian media until very recently was soft peddling all of this. They weren't, like, Russian media wasn't talking about this. They were talking about everything but this. Invading Ukraine isn't the same. I mean, it was all invading Ukraine, I suppose, but invading Ukraine to, like, occupy Kiev, or even just to, like, push back the front from Luhansk and Donetsk, plays significantly worse with the Russian public than occupying Crimea did. Occupying Crimea played well, at least with a large subset of the public. That was seen as like retaking genuinely like unequivocally Russian territory in their minds. International law in Ukraine didn't see it that way, but it was also done sort of bloodlessly, and it was all good, from their perspective. Like, fighting a war with Ukraine, I don't think plays anywhere near as well with the Russian public, and it felt like that was the Russian model, and recently in the last couple of days they've pivoted, and now their organs are saying, Ukrainians are insane, and Ukrainians are fascists, and Ukrainians want to kill Russians, and so we have to do this. But there was a strong sense they didn't think this would be a winner. Pardon me. Talking about water bomb. So I don't know that this is, I mean, I'm sure this is internally driven, but I don't know that this is the same, driven internally in the same way as I think Crimea was. Or this is like a massive, winner, for him in the same way. The Russian counterinsurgency model is awful, especially the second Chechen war, where, they would basically just advance troops forward, take fire from a building, and then level the building. If you look at photos of Grozny after the second Chechen war, there was nothing left. It was like, it made, parts of Syria look peaceful. They leveled just about every fucking building in the entire city. There are a couple of challenges to doing, to the Russian coin model as it was applied in Chechnya, if it was applied to Ukraine. Firstly, just size. Grozny is a much, much smaller city, and Chechnya is a fairly small oblast, compared to Ukraine, a country of 40 odd million people, one of the largest countries the largest country entirely in Europe. That's point one. Point two, the Russian coin model ultimately relied on essentially finding a local warlord that was unbelievably brutal already and basically had tribal loyalties and was willing to run the place under Putin's auspices, provided he was basically allowed to do whatever he wanted. Much harder to do that in Ukraine because it's just not a Central Asian republic. Like the clan lines don't work the same way. So it's hard to do that. There's going to be a lot more media watching, so I don't know that they're just going to be able to level every single building in Kiev in order to make it a more coin-friendly battleground. Then every Western intelligence agency you can imagine is going to be funneling equipment, money, training, and support to any Ukrainian insurgency, which they didn't really have to deal with in Chechnya. Chechnya was like a homegrown thing, and I'm sure some intelligence agencies were kind of fucking around there a bit, but it wasn't really anybody's focus. Remember, Chechnya was kind of happening during the war on terror. We were all sort of on the same side. It's going to be Charlie Wilson's war all over. I mean, in a way, it already is, because they started sending the manpads, but it's going to be Charlie Wilson's war forever, because if you are the West, there is a really, really strong incentive for you to send for the lesson of this to be that this is really hard and you shouldn't do it. That occupying, because basically, like, in a hypothetical where he occupies Kiev, that becomes the template, and what happens next becomes the template for whether he can then occupy cities in Estonia, Latvia, the Baltics, wherever. Like, that's the natural progression, right? And so if Russia sticks its hand into Ukraine and comes out very badly burnt, or even is just occupied there, fighting an incredibly strong and bloody counterinsurgency battle, from the West perspective, from the West perspective, that works out just fine. It's horrendous because, of course, it turns in the country of my birth into a perennial weird proxy battleground against a state that has absolutely no moral qualms about committing war crimes, torture, and whatever you name it, in order to prosecute a successful counterinsurgency. But from the West perspective, it makes a lot of sense to arm that insurgency non-stop and keep it alive. So for all of those reasons, I think the Russian coin model isn't necessarily going to be as viable in Ukraine as it was in Grozny and in Chechnya. I mean, unfortunately, there's no way you can even speculate about all that without picturing sort of a lot of dead people, and that's just unbelievably awful. So yes, can't believe that's the good news, but there you go. So hopefully they have factored that in, and that's why they won't. I mean, I don't think there is ever going to be a genuine NATO military response anyway, in terms of overt, because the consequences of a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia are too horrific to contemplate. That is kind of civilization-ending stuff. And so, even if there was a giant refugee wave, which, would be bad, and I just don't see a kinetic NATO response. If you're talking about sort of doing everything else, then yes. Yeah, interface, I mean, you'd think. But there were those interviews of Russian-speaking mothers mourning their dead sons for the troops they sent into Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014-15. They've been there the whole time. The Russian media just shuts them out. Yeah, I mean, does this lead to a realignment? Does this lead to kind of a change in natural gas prices and oil prices? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an energy analyst. I mean, as you said, as Light Switch is saying, like, fracking's already pretty viable. It's a really interesting question, Nazi666, whether the Russians miscalculated thinking that Ukraine and NATO would compromise. I honestly don't know, because it's not clear what kind of compromise Putin could have accepted to make this go away. The demands, like, if their expectation or their demand had been more, like, vaguely reasonable, then I would have had more like grounds for that theory. This idea that they just miscalculated NATO resolve and that they thought they could extract concessions. I don't know that I buy that, because the requests were just like, you can't pull NATO out of Latvia, like NATO troops out of Latvia, because Latvian troops are NATO troops. So if you pull Latvian, like, unless the Latvian army disbands or all moves to France, a lot of the requests were equally kind of bonkers, as well as effectively kind of letting Russia run Ukraine. So I think the things they were asking for, they knew would be rejected, which makes me think this isn't necessarily a miscalculation on their part in terms of they thought they were going to get concessions and they didn't. I do think it's possible. I do think it's possible that they miscalculated the scale of the opposition to this and how bad this would make them look, and that they basically just at some point got locked into their plans that they had expected to be happening under a much bigger smoke screen of EU, NATO, Western division, much less focus, and much kind of, they expected the ground to be smoother. Do I think other powers like the People's Republic of China will offer intelligence or military assistance to Russia if its proxies? I mean, I don't know what their kind of intelligence sharing arrangements would be. I don't know that the Chinese intelligence network in Ukraine is worth a damn. That's not where their focus is. So I don't know how useful it would be. I don't think the Chinese are going to offer military assistance in Ukraine. For one thing, Chinese force projection just isn't that robust. You need quite a lot of specialized resources to maintain a military presence that far away from your country, and China's focuses its military elsewhere. China's about being a regional power, and Ukraine's really far from its region. I don't know if Russia would care if Bosnia joins NATO. I would suspect that, like, the reason they don't care might be because, like, Bosnia won't. If that makes sense. Like, because, but I don't pretend to understand, like, the Baltic side of this at all. It's just not my field. There's some great people on Twitter who look at this stuff more closely. I can't remember how old I was when Yugoslavia happened. 8 or something. So no, I don't think so. Yeah, we are devoted to a peaceful and diplomatic solution. We are on our own land. We don't fear anyone, we don't owe anything to anyone, and we won't give anything up. It's a nice sentiment. But it's, this is, Anastasia is very good. She's on that list, of people to follow, by the way. If you're not following that list, let me repost it for those who have just joined, because it is fantastic. Oops. Copy limit. No, drop that into chat. And it is a list by Anders, should probably credit him, by Anders Ostlund. Alright guys, well it's getting on to be 1:30. And I am exhausted physically, emotionally, and most acutely vocally. You guys can probably hear my voice getting out. No one ever believes me, but I'm an intense introvert who doesn't love the sound of my own voice. And sort of in the absolute worst possible career, as I often have to stand in front of large groups of people and speak for hours at a time. But my voice is never caught up with what I actually do for a living. So with a huge thank you to all of you for coming to hang out, coming to just process, I guess. It's a really big day in history, I think, as so many of you said, this is the old order's not the same as it was. And things have changed today. And streaming's a weird way to mark that, but I really appreciate you guys being here, lending your thoughts, lending your support, your good wishes, your questions, and your company. So thank you all, and have a lovely night, and stay safe, and keep Ukraine in your prayers. It's about the most we can do. Thanks so much, guys.